Hello, everyone, and welcome back to JKPI's Expert Talk series. So, I'm Jagyasa, I'm the head of strategy and partnerships, and today I'll be introducing to you the JKPI's initiative. The Expert Talk series is a special initiative of the Jammu and Kashmir Policy Institute, where we seek to source inputs and recommendations from experts in various fields pertaining to different sustainable development goals through one-on-one dialogue. As an organization, JKPI believes in multi-stakeholder dialogues as one of the most important components, building a shared vision for development in Kashmir and true to our faith in the same. We have initiated this series to engage experts, change makers, pioneers from various walks of life to understand the dynamic context of implementing sustainable development goals on our agenda. Every week, we seek to host experts who would share with us on the different dimensions of the challenges and possibilities while drawing from their own rich repertoire of experience in the field. We believe that personal stories of passionate pursuit of goals, research on addressed gaps, and efforts to be a part of the change is a very big aspect of development in action at an individual level. We are hopeful that these stories would inspire many people over the following weeks. And now, not taking much time, I would like to introduce to you today's topic as well as our speaker. So today we have with us Makrouk Inayat. I know she doesn't need any introduction, but doing the formality, she is the former primetime TV anchor and senior broadcast journalist. Makrouk Inayat led the newsroom at Times Now as senior editor and Headlines Today, as editor at large, and then as jobbing editor. As a journalist, Makrouk's 72 hours non-stop reportage from outside Taj Mahal during 26/11 earned her much acclaim and was appreciated as an example of unbiased coverage of the Mumbai terror strike. She was the last Indian journalist to interview Banerjee Bhutto before the assassination of the former Pakistan Prime Minister. Makrouk has reported extensively on national politics with special focus on on the Kashmir imbroglio. She has interviewed Narendra Modi, Omar Abdullah, Sachin Tendulkar, Amitabh Bachchan, and Arvind Kejriwal, among many other celebrities. She has won several awards for her work, including the Jammu and Kashmir Government's Award for Outstanding Achievement as a Media Personality 2009. After a master's in broadcast journalism from American University, Washington, D.C., she went on to complete her fellowship at Georgetown Leadership Seminar at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C., and organizing Leadership and Action Program at Kennedy School. Howard University. She currently also consults as contributing editor for senior journalist Shekhar Gupta startup The Print. And today she would be speaking on the topic gender equality and journalism. Ma'am, we are really grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jigyasa, and thank you for that extremely generous introduction.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And because we are already running out of time, so without any much delay, I guess let's start with the entire dialogue series. And I don't think that I have any other question to start with than this particular one. You did a 27-hour non-stop reportage from outside the Taj Mahal during 26/11. So my first question is actually related to the same. Putting a gender lens, how has been your experience in ground reporting, ma'am? What are the risks and benefits of having diversity in the coverage and reporting of news? And ma'am is definitely fine. You have already informed us regarding the electricity part, so it's complete.
Yes, I just wanted to tell everyone that I'm in Srinagar and it's been raining this entire evening and suddenly the electricity has gone. So I've switched on the phone torch. So please bear with me if I look a little odd and eerie with this lighting. But yes, please go ahead.
So, ma'am, I guess I should repeat this question. And uh, as I just mentioned, that this is one of the major things that I have been so keen to learn from you, that your entire work during the 26/11, you did a 72 hours non-stop reportage from outside Taj Mahal. So, putting a gender lens, how has been your experience in ground reporting? What are the risks and benefits of having diversity in the coverage and reporting of news?
Okay, let me start by saying that, that fateful night of 26th November 2008, I have to say that that evening, I finished the 9 p.m. show that I used to co-anchor with Arnab at that point, called the News Hour. And when he got information that there was something to the level that it was happening outside in various parts of Mumbai, at that point, obviously, we didn't know that there was the siege would become what it did over the next 2 or 3 days. Um, the first point that I wanted to make was that at that point, my editor in chief didn't look at me as a man or a woman. He just looked at me as a journalist, and he asked me to go out and report. Cut to when I was outside the Taj Hotel on the night of 26/11. I was looking at it primarily as a journalist. You look at a situation and you want to be factual, you want to be empathetic. You know, retrospectively, when we look back, there are several other shades that you add to the dynamics of what actually happened. But when you're on the ground and reporting, you want to be factual and you want to be empathetic to the situation. So, those were the two fundamental things that I had in mind. Even when I put on a gender lens, I don't think it was any different from anybody else who was reporting from there. I mean, apart from the fact that, being a woman and the entire area being under Section 144, you couldn't find a restroom around. And perhaps that was the one big problem that I faced, and many of my other contemporaries, female journalists who were there. But over the course of those 72 hours, we did have some very sympathetic restaurateurs in that area. If people who are familiar with that area, there are quite a lot of hotels there. So they were sympathetic, and I did get a restroom, and so did a lot of my contemporaries. I can imagine that as being the biggest risk, or rather things that most people wouldn't think of, because my male contemporaries would find a wall somewhere and be fine with that. But for a woman, I think those are inherently the kind of disadvantages that we have. But honestly, as a woman journalist, the risks are the same as any of your male counterparts. You understand the situation that you're in. It was extraordinary. There was an extraordinary situation unraveling in front of us. Um, from a gender lens, when you ask me that what are the risks and benefits, I don't see any risks really. I see a lot of benefits. Yes, there are physical risks involved. Yes, there are risks that perhaps women need to be far more careful when reporting at night, for instance, when reporting in an area where you're not particularly safe. I see during this pandemic a lot of young female journalists going to areas where there are risks of, apart from the infection, there are also several other risks. You know, when you go in the interiors of Uttar Pradesh, in places like Unnao and so on, there would be safety risks. And there are organizations who are very aware of that risk. But I would assume that for a large part, the benefits far outweigh the risks. And those security apparatus that needs to be in place, I think, is there for most mainline, or I would say national publications. Yes, for a lot of regional publications, perhaps the same emphasis is not given. I come from a point of privilege with the kind of organizations that I have worked with. So I haven't seen that. But remember, at the end of the day, as journalists, uh, when you're confronted with an extraordinary situation, you're just a journalist, and gender perhaps is not the first thing that comes in mind.
Thank you very much. And I guess you have already highlighted some really important issues. That firstly, that yes, definitely benefits actually exceed the risk, but at the same time, we should also keep in mind, for example, the risks related to the infrastructure that is not available, usually on ground,
Yes,
specifically for a female journalist,
yes.
and in terms of the physicality that are those are involved in it. So if I just try to move the entire environment and look at a very close environment, so you have worn many hats in your career, a TV anchor, editor, journalist, and many other leadership roles. So, based on your experience, do you think women still faces challenges in coming at the top position? What is the impact of more diversity at the decision-making level?
You know, I want to add one more role that I have donned in recent times, which is that of an entrepreneur. And the difference between other roles and an entrepreneur is you're pretty much your own. You find yourself at the top to begin with, or at the bottom, whichever way you want to look at it. But having said that, there are various challenges, Jigyasa, and challenges begin right at the family level. uh, when you start out, there are certain stigmas attached. Let me give you the example of being in the media, right? When you start out right at the family level, there are stigmas attached. There might be certain reservations that your family has. Then comes at a organizational level. At an organizational level, it is very hard, and challenges exist. I again come from privilege where I haven't seen those kind of challenges, but I have enough stories and more, where the fact that perhaps if you announce that you're going to get married, a woman is looked at differently. There is assumed in certain circles and newsrooms that perhaps your priorities might change without you ever indicating that. The next challenge would be if you decide to be a mother, or if you're an expectant mother, you are perhaps seen as somebody who might not be able to go out in the field and report, if you're looking at the dynamics of a newsroom. Even otherwise, it might be assumed by some that your priorities have changed. And while these are challenges, I have seen that, remarkably enough, women who persist and continue to work hard and persevere, eventually your peer group starts seeing what you really bring to the table and how you're able to strike that balance. And then that challenge also, because when I heard your question, I wanted to not just tell you what the challenge is, but also how a lot of women circumvent that challenge and eventually reach positions of decision making. So yes, family pressures, societal pressures, and organizational pressures do exist. But a lot of women, and increasingly, and I'm very happy to say that increasingly women are being able to break the glass ceiling and to prove themselves over and over again. Yes, it is harder for them. By no means am I saying that it is not hard, because these perceptions do exist. But by the sheer number of women that we see increasingly come forth in the past decade or so, it is just their sheer perseverance that despite what people around them think, they believe that they can strike the balance. They increasingly show it through their work, and they have to prove it at home as well, because it's not just in the workplace. At home, they're constantly questioned on where do your priorities lie as a mother, as a wife, and so on and so forth. So I think it requires to persevere, and I believe increasingly women are doing so. And to the second part of your question, that how does diversity help at the decision making level? Tremendously. I mean, the first thing it does is it gives you phenomenal perspective. Imagine that you have a body, a decision making body, that just has a particular gender, or a particular religion, or a particular region that dominates it. Then you're going to be falling short of a perspective all along. And that perspective, or lack of it, is going to lead to a lack of understanding. Again, I give the example of a newsroom. If you have different perspectives coming in, there'll be different angles to a story, because a newsroom is not far removed from what society is at large. A newsroom is an extension. Journalists, after all, at the end of the day, are people like you and me and everybody else. They have the same biases, the same prejudices, and or lack of knowledge, therefore, and they come into the newsroom with those limited perspectives. But when you sit together in a simple thing as an edit meeting, and there are 10 different people with 10 different perspectives, you just add that much more to a story. And that is how it happens in all decision making bodies. The more perspectives you have, the better it is. I mean, in an organization that I run today, there are much younger people than me, and their perspective, for instance, to this work life balance that we call, which I never had in my life. I never had work life balance. I was told it doesn't exist. But now the younger generation tells me that it does, and it's extremely important. So, of course, you require diversity. Diversity equals to perspective, equals to understanding.
Thank you, ma'am, for bringing this point. And I believe your first point regarding the challenges that women face, specifically at the family level. So I would say related to the social cultural norms that exist, and then at the organization level, I guess we can find it not just in journalism but in many other fields. Like in most of the dominant field that we talk about today, it's actually there in every other field. But it's really nice to hear this thing that there are many women who are persisting and actually breaking this particular barrier. And on your second point of increasing the diversity and how it actually helps in build and bringing in more perspective and understanding is actually very important and something that we actually need to have on various tables. And my other question is actually very related to this one. Where do you see the role of media in the portrayal of women and reinforcing or breaking down the existing structures and stereotypes?
Um, it's a very important question, Jigyasa. I mean, the whole of last year, and I think a lot of questions have been raised about it. Enough has been said about it, but I'd still like to reiterate that the whole of last year, we saw the focus, instead of being on this unprecedented pandemic, the focus seemed to be on one woman, Ria Chakrabarti, for a huge part of, the media conversation, larger conversation at length, social media conversations, and so on. And here was a woman who was being looked at as pure in pure binaries. Some looked at her as a victim, and the other part looked at her as a gold digger. Right? That in many ways tells us how a woman is portrayed, and how a certain section of the media kind of enhances that. Um, so I think we are far away from how women are being this is just one example, right, of how certain perceptions about women are created, and certain old archaic thoughts about women are perpetuated, and the media plays a part in that as well. As a fourth estate, of course, we have a very, very important role to play. And we're not just talking about news media. Today, with social media, a large part of that portrayal, certain perceptions do exist. But I always look at the silver lining, and I believe that there is a lot now being done to certainly change certain perceptions, to make it more, and the more participation by women, the more I see slowly change coming in. The more women speak out, the more I think that perception is going to change. I forgot the last part of your question. If you could repeat that, then I can perhaps answer that.
Yes, sure, ma'am. So just a minute, ma'am.
No worries.
Where do you see the role of media in the portrayal of women and reinforcing or breaking down existing stereotypes?
Yes, so the media has to play a very significant role. The media is continuing to play. In certain ways, we do see that those certain prejudices and stereotypes continue, and often it says that life imitates art, and so on and so forth. But and a lot of media will give you the argument that we give to our audiences what they are looking for. But I think the media has to play the role of a watchdog, and also informer at the same time. And significantly, I think in this race for TRPs, a lot is lost. But I feel that especially digital media today is doing a phenomenal job in trying to change that, in trying to give more voice to women. Earlier we had a certain number of publications, we had a certain number of news channels, but today, interestingly, we have certain portals dominating, or specifically looking at women's issues. We have social media influencers that are talking about that. So I think that increasingly there is space for a lot of dialogue. There is space for different kinds of conversations taking place, and not just looking at women and portrayal of women and women issues in a very specific way. So earlier, if you were told that women's issues will only have a restricted space in newspapers or in print publications, today you have websites that are only looking at catering to certain issues regarding women. And I hope these publications do well and these websites do well, because I think they are making a mark.
Thank you, ma'am. And I guess there's one thing that it just has come out with your answer, that is the role of social media as well as digital media. It was something that wasn't part of what I initially thought, but I guess this is one important point that we should be talking about. And I just came into this particular thing, and I think you are the person who can actually answer this part. As you uh, rightly mentioned, that it has increased the participation and increased space for dialogue, and more women are coming in and sharing their own perspective. But at the same time, there is also increasing space for misinformation as well as opinion that is against women, or even I would say human rights. So where do you think is the balance between both, and how it is utilized?
See, I'm somebody who believes that yes, there is a lot of disinformation, there is a lot of fake news, and there are organizations that are trying to create checks and balances to reduce that. There are organizations that are calling out fake news. But I personally believe that the more these issues are spoken about, that is critical. Rather than just keeping quiet because we're worried that this might be mutilated and made to sound something completely different. I think that's not a fear that one must have. Those are checks and balances over a period of time. We're still in the process of understanding the extent of what digital media can do. We're not in a position where we've seen 100 years of digital media, and today we're in a position to understand its breadth, its intensity, and the scope of what it can do. I think we're still understanding, and it's constantly evolving. I believe there are organizations that have already put checks and balances, but we need to speak. Women's issues need to be discussed. Gender narratives must be built. We cannot stop shy of that by fearing that, oh, this might be misconstrued to mean something else. I think the more we speak about it, the more that argument will be defined, argued even more, and perhaps the finer points will come out. But just we can't stop right now. Right now, the debate is growing, it's becoming far more engaging, it is becoming far more robust. So the more we speak, the more we deliberate on it, the better it is.
Thank you, ma'am. And I guess the point of that the entire field of digital media and social media is actually evolving, and that's why it will actually take some time to put proper structures of checks and balances. So I guess that is actually one of the areas where policymakers should come in and have their eyes on that, where we actually gonna make certain structure that's gonna do and serve the need. And if I, okay, there's one point that you mentioned about the gender narrative, and I'm going to come on that part later on. And just going a little back in your personal experience. So I read that you have your master's in broadcast journalism from American University. So my question is related to this education and journalism. So where do you see role of media and journalism education in fostering gender equality? What has been your experience as a student, and given your years of experience in the field, what amendments do you think could be made in the education system?
Okay, so let me start. Even before my master's in broadcast journalism from American University, I did my undergrad in journalism honors from Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi. And the reason why I bring that up is because it was a program specifically to make us journalists. And the issues that we dealt with, the subjects we had ranged from political science to economics to law to media studies to the evolution of media in the country. But nowhere was there any focus on two important issues that I felt. One was gender studies, and the other was health. And I felt these were two fundamental subjects, or health reporting for that matter, or women's issues, women's studies that should have been a part of our program. And again, when I went to the US and I did my master's, the core subjects that we were supposed to have as in order to complete our masters included everything from communication law to the tenets of journalism and to world affairs, to international affairs, to diplomacy, and so on. But again, gender studies featured nowhere. And the reason why I say that is because I feel today's journalists, men and women both, must be given refresher courses in order to understand how to deal with gender narratives. These are extremely nuanced subjects, and I feel both men and women must be enabled to have a nuanced conversation about gender narratives. I think in in an environment where you're called woke, and terms that youngsters like you use, I think a lot of journalists, and with due respect to all, I include myself in that tribe. I think we are far removed from the realities of how to deal with gender narratives. We are going by gut right now. We go by what intrinsically comes to us. But I think a far more nuanced training needs to be given to all journalists. And I think internationally it happens in all reputed organizations, media organizations specifically, that they get refresher programs on how to deal with issues. Issues like rape, for instance. How do you cover a rape story? What is the kind of sensitivity that is required in order to deal with a rape story? How do you talk to a victim, if at all? How do you deal with the perpetrators? How do you address them in the stories? I think none of that is taught to journalists by and large. At least I wasn't taught that. I wasn't taught how to deal with that. How do you deal with a young girl who perhaps has mental issues, or has tried to commit suicide because she didn't get enough good marks, or a dowry victim for that matter? These are things that need to be taught, in fact, to journalists, because in journalism schools you're being taught the basic tenets of journalism: how to go and get a story, how to write a story. But these sensitivities need to come in, and I think these were not taught to me, at least in journalism school. I don't know if younger students of journalism are taught that. And I think even if they are, all along their career there need to be refresher courses on how to deal with such situations. How do you deal with a victim of trauma? How do you today deal with somebody who's a covid patient and is dealing with it, or somebody who's lost a patient or a survivor? These are sensitivities that do not exist. And especially with your question with gender narrative, I think every journalist needs to be sensitized to these vulnerabilities.
Thank you, ma'am. And this entire point of gender studies, I guess this is something we all should be emphasizing, because coming from my own personal experience, I'm a student of peace and conflict studies. So gender was specifically emphasized as one of the major thing that we should be considering. And while I was studying international relations and political science, gender was not a part of that subject. And I believe that actually there was a huge gap that actually covered my master while pursuing my peace and conflict studies. So
Okay.
definitely this is one area. And secondly, that I believe is the most important point that you have mentioned is that such studies like gender studies, gender sensitization, or having training how to deal with trauma victim, these things should be taught to everyone and not just women, because mainly there's a narrative, that women are more, they have this nature of being soft and feminine. So this is something that we need to go against, and it should be taught to everyone. And you have mentioned one term again and again, and that is gender narrative. So if I just ask you, like, in terms of narratives, we see that gender is a human right issue, but in the dominant media, we don't see it in the same manner. Like, it's not considered as a human right issue, or gender narratives or gender talks. These are not a part of the dominant culture in the media. So where do you think we are today, and why? Why we don't have such voices coming out who are talking about gender narratives or narratives around human rights much in the dominant media, specifically in India?
Honestly, I would I'd disagree with you a bit, because I think those voices are coming out. I think increasingly we are hearing more of journalists and otherwise talking about gender as a human rights issue. Um, it wasn't there 20 years ago when I started my career, for sure. Might have been, but in very, very limited terms. I didn't hear of it enough. I didn't read about it enough. I think that change is already happening. And I think while the media is castigated for a lot of issues, I think one must give some credit where it's due that, especially with the advent of digital media, a lot of that is being addressed. We have young editors of digital organizations and otherwise who are far more sensitive to this issue and are writing about it, are doing stories that talk about the issue, are giving space to young speakers and to young writers who want to write about the gender narrative. So things are changing. It might be slow. I'm not saying that we have reached a place where we can be, lie back and say, we're in a good place. But I would not go into the other extreme and say that nothing has happened. I'm more of an optimist, an eternal optimist, and I believe that that step has already been taken. And I believe a lot is being written. A lot, I'm sure, would come on your social media timeline, whether it was different issues that are spoken about, from equal pay to menstrual menstruation leave, to other gender narratives and conversations. I think a step in the right direction has been taken. It requires a lot more given how big the issue is. But I can't say that we are completely unaware or as we were when perhaps I started out as a journalist.
Thank you, man. I would love to be on the pessimist, on the optimist side, I would say. And I'm not a media person, definitely, but I believe that based on your answer, digital media is actually playing a very important role in bringing in these voices. And I guess with dominant media, somewhere I see like how news channels report any particular news or share the information. So that I guess a different story. But definitely, I guess digital media, as you have already emphasized, is actually helping us to change the narrative itself. Uh, and with that, I would like to just shift a more internal because I would personally like to understand how internally everything works in your field. So, how acceptable and accessible is the environment in the media industry for women and especially for the LGBTQ community?
I think I think for women, let me start with women. Uh, look around. Look at primetime news anchors. Look at dominant personalities in the media. I think you would find an equal number of male and female media personalities. I believe that the media perhaps has been one of the most accepting and equal workspaces, at least that I have experienced. I've dealt with other industries as well, and I find that I personally, at least I worked in two different news stations, and I haven't seen women being treated any less or any different than their male counterparts. Yes, there is often boy talk. There might be small boys clubs, but nothing that can take away from the kind of work that a woman needs to do. In fact, in both the organizations that I was at, there were more women than men in the newsroom. And I didn't see any kind of discrimination done. There was never a story that you were told that, oh, only your male colleague can do it and you can't. In fact, we were encouraged to go out and do all the big stories or small stories or dangerous stories, from encounters to, traveling anywhere in the country. So I didn't see that. And I'm not talking just for myself, I'm talking of a lot of my colleagues. I don't know what the situation is in tier 2 or tier 3 towns. From what I hear, yes, they have a long way to come in terms of giving the same kind of acknowledgement and opportunity. But there are also a lot of social stigmas attached for women being in the media. Now, as far as the LGBTQ community is concerned, like I said, the media, newsrooms, media organizations are just a reflection of the larger society that we're in. We're still the same people, like all of us right now, like you and everybody else. Whatever prejudices and biases you have outside the newsroom, those come into the newsroom as well. You don't suddenly change when you become journalists. Those biases and prejudices exist. Now, for the LGBTQ community, I find that just like cosmopolitan cities are far more accepting of the LGBTQ community, and I say that relatively, to smaller towns and cities. Similarly, news organizations in bigger cities are far more open to them. And again, I have to say that I won't discriminate between, say, digital or TV or print for that matter. I see that in bigger cities, that acceptance is there, and it is growing. But again, just like our society is slowly progressing towards accepting these relationships and this community, similarly, our newsrooms are a reflection of that. But I would say a large number of media organizations are leading the charge and making sure they give beautiful examples of how the LGBT community should get the kind of representation that it deserves.
Thank you, ma'am. And this is really good to hear that how media organizations are actually taking steps in order to make the work environment more acceptable and more accessible to all the various
Yes,
groups.
Jigyasa, because you must understand that when homosexuality was criminalized in this country, it was the media that was at the forefront of highlighting it and making sure that enough pressure was put on the government to reverse that order and decriminalize homosexuality. So the media did play its role. Yes, of course, stereotypes exist. We are not in an ideal situation. But I think media organizations perhaps are the place where they are getting what is rightfully theirs, or their voice is being heard.
Definitely, ma'am. And I remember personally that the entire coverage that was there regarding the entire law and the Supreme Court, how it was actually going in, there was a lot of perspective that were actually coming in from the dominant media itself and not just from various digital media platforms. So that was, I guess, very helpful in terms of actually changing the perspective of general population at the same time, because I saw my parents talking about the same, like they were watching TV and the changes were coming there. So if I just try to shift from um the field itself and come more into the public policy stream, I know you would say that this is something which is not there, but where do you see that policymakers could actually do something in terms of making the work environment more gender neutral, or any sort of change that they could actually work on in terms of making the entire work environment more acceptable to all different or various groups?
A great question. I'm not a public policy person. I've studied it a bit, but purely from being a journalist and being in a newsroom, I feel that at various levels. One is at the personal level. In a large number of organizations, there is still a culture of silence when it comes to talking about sexual harassment at the workplace, because there is an inherent distrust of, bosses, and how perhaps their career growth will be hampered if they were to report that. That still exists, and there is data and enough studies done that seem to suggest that women and perhaps even men are very scared of coming out and reporting it. I think that needs to be strengthened. Secondly, security of journalists when they're out in the field, when they're reporting, has to be strengthened at a policy level. I mean, today we have international organizations still reporting that men and women both are being targeted, and women increasingly so, not just for what they're reporting, but for the very fact that they're women and they have a voice. There's still those prejudices. So, on ground reporting and the safety of journalists in that. And thirdly, and I see this increasingly happening, is online security, the kind of trolling that female journalists particularly see. And it might not necessarily have to do with the stories that they're doing, but just because they're women, the attacks that they face are highly sexualized. They face threats, the kind of messages that they get, which have a huge impact on journalists. So, at a policy level, there will be, I believe, there need to be certain actions that are taken to strengthen and to make the work environment, both offline and online, far more conducive for journalists to go about their work, and especially women.
Thank you, man, for highlighting these points, and I'm really sorry for the background noise that is coming right now. Uh,
I
I
can't
guess.
hear any background noise. I can't hear
Thank you
it.
so much, because there's certain machine going around. So, uh, I guess your point regarding the sexual harassment, and this is one of the major debate that we see in media and journalism both, and there have been many cases that are also ongoing right now. So definitely, I guess this is one of the areas that needs to be worked out more. And the point of trolling, I guess this is another point that needs to be discussed. And I was just reading one report. I just opened the report right now. It's a report from the Coalition for Women in Journalism. So they recently reported that how female journalists were reporting from ground the farmers' protest. So they saw a lot of backlash, both from all the sides, specifically from farmer side. Video organizations, specifically, they came and they stopped them from reporting. And at the same time, there's a lot of backlash on social media platform as well. There was a lot of trolling. So where do you think are these things going? Like, how do you see we can actually cater to these things, like trolling, online trolling, and how it is specifically more focused, and how should I say women become more victim to these measures like online trolling?
They absolutely do. I mean, I'll give you an example. If you're first on ground reporting, I remember you spoke about 26/11 on day two of on the 27th of November. I was standing outside the Taj Hotel and reporting. It had been nearly what 24 hours since I had first gotten there, and we still didn't have Section 144 imposed, and I was surrounded by a group of people because by then they were still coming there and they were saying things like hum ugarwadi dekhne aaye hain, because by then they had still not imposed section 144. And suddenly I was surrounded by a lot of men. Most of them were inebriated, and things started getting very uncomfortable, and here I was live on camera, and I started reporting what was happening around me. Thankfully I had a few colleagues of mine who made a circle around me like a protective ring to ensure that I was safe. uh, but those are the challenges. I mean, there have been innumerable occasions where I have reported from rallies. These are places where there are huge groups of people around you, and invariably you find yourself feeling unsafe and being made to feel unsafe. um, in that you have to, I mean, your organization can put all the checks and balances in place, but the situation is such that they can't have an army of people around you, right? You have to keep your wits about you. You must make sure that all provisions are taken of how you can keep safe, and your colleagues are always there, and there are always people around you also who, usually there's a separate media enclosure that they keep. Those are on ground things, that hacks that you need to think of. Protect yourself, ensure you have your wits about you. But in terms of online trolling, these are platforms that are massive. I'm talking about social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and so on. These platforms will have to have those kind of checks and balances, that journalists are not subjected to this kind of online trolling, and they just need to have really stricter. I mean, there's so many journalists who, my timeline is often filled with journalists, female journalists, talking about how they're getting death threats and their phone numbers being put on social media and on WhatsApp groups, and they getting disgusting calls and extremely profane pictures being sent to them. I mean, this is a very, very real thing, and it affects the mental peace of a lot of women, as it would to anybody. I can't even imagine what one would go through. I have been the subject of this in the past, and it really impacts you in a very, very bad way. So, platforms need to have those checks and balances. I mean, as a journalist, it is your job to put out information. You happen to be a woman, and the first thing that trolls want to attack is the fact that you're a woman and not the story that you're doing, because they might perhaps not have a ploy to to in any way do anything against facts, but they can definitely target you for being a woman. So I believe these platforms need to have those checks and balances, and it is very possible, unlike what they say. So that needs to be done, because your own organization can't help beyond a point, and you can't do much about it. So these social media platforms will need to have those checks and balances that protect journalists.
And ma'am, I guess one of the point that you mentioned, that these platforms can actually do it. I believe that some way, because there are not enough emphasis on them to actually come up with these checks and balances, that they're also trying to somewhere, ignore it, or at least these things are not coming in as the priority area that we need to work on. For example, we see recently how Facebook and WhatsApp, their privacy issues has been, a lot of time they have been discussed in many countries, not just in India. But somewhere, I guess, these issues of how specifically journalists and women journalists, they need to be protected online. These things are not coming much into the major media. Like this is my own personal perspective. I don't know exactly how it
I
goes
agree
inside
with
the
your
media.
perspective, Jigyasa. I mean, Facebook faced a maximum amount of, there's a committee of inquiry into the level of fake news that was being put on Facebook, and they did take preventive action. And today you don't see as much of it. Similarly, other organizations and other platforms are doing the same. So I'm pretty sure the more we speak about it, the more they need to take that into account. But yes, maybe you're right, not enough is being said, or they're not taking it seriously right now.
And you also pointed out a very good point, that is the impact that you usually have. So, if I just try to relate it with my own experience of a peace builder, when we actually go into field and see what has been happening, for example, if there is a case of violence against a woman. So, I think that same could be said in terms of how journalists, when they go on field and they see a lot of violence or any other thing that is happening on ground. So I would say, my question is simply that how you actually manage that mental pressure that you may receive, because definitely whatever you are seeing, for example, if you're seeing live violence and you are reporting from there, so how you actually manages that particular mental pressure that you actually go through at that particular time.
I think, again, a very relevant question. I think uh, you might learn a lot in classes, but it is the experience of one such, reporting assignment that kind of builds it in you. I won't say that every journalist who goes out and does his or her first assignment is prepared to handle it. Like I said, we are individuals just like anybody else, and of course it affects you. But I would say you have to remember that being factual while being empathetic is the key to handle such situations. And yes, journalists can falter. We are, after all, human beings, and situations can get out of hand. It can impact you. Sometimes journalists, I was just reading on Twitter that an Al Jazeera journalist broke down while reporting about the Israel Palestinian issue right now. So, of course, it impacts you. You might see today when journalists like Preeti Chaudhary are going in different parts of UP and seeing so many dead bodies around them. Of course, it will affect you. But as long as it doesn't cloud your judgment on what to report, and your own opinion rather than your factual reporting is not there, then it is a problem. Because you can't, while journalism is about bringing the truth out, it is different from activism. And a lot of times the two get kind of blurred, the lines get blurred. We are there to present the story to the outside world without our own opinion in it. And eventually, it is for the viewer to decide how he or she deciphers that information. But ours, or what kind of perspective or opinion they gather from there. But our job as journalists is to be factual and empathetic.
A very well emphasized point, I believe, ma'am, because many times we do see that in terms of when we read a particular article, we see that how emotion just comes in and it actually blurs the facts. So definitely one of the major points I believe that I would be, taking with me is you need to balance between information and how you empathize with a particular story or a particular individual. And I'm from this, like you just mentioned about your particular experience of reporting from ground. So this particular thing came to my head, like how you actually deal with various actors, or I should say stakeholders. I don't know exact terminology, but you see people, for example, in a protest, people are coming from various backgrounds. Then you also have politicians, you also have police, and you have many other, like you have your colleagues as well. So how you actually deal in such an environment, and usually we see most of the time is mainly male who are already on ground. So how have been your experience, and what would you like to share about the same?
Could you explain your question? I didn't quite understand the question. As in, as a woman dealing with various actors of a story, in what way?
Basically,
Give
how a
an
female
example.
journalist
Mm-hmm.
deals with various actors, specifically on ground, where situation is completely uncertain and we don't know how things will gonna turn out.
Well, Jigyasa, not very differently from how my male counterpart would deal with that situation. So let me give you an example. Suppose you're in the middle of a protest and you can suddenly sense that, things might get heated up or there is a chance of violence. Like I said, if you find a large number of people or men surrounding you suddenly and you start feeling unsafe, then the most important, what is, and that perhaps, every woman knows that when you go out, for instance, you, Jigyasa, go out for a concert, right? And if you're suddenly surrounded by too many men around you, you will find your safe space. It's the same for a journalist as well. In terms of various actors that you deal with, the actors of a story in that sense, well, first of all, before you go to a situation, you must know enough about it before you get there. It's not that you go there and then, other than if the situation happens in front of you, like an attack or a terrorist incident, then you're figuring out what's happening around you. But if you're going to a protest or a rally where you already know what the basics of the story are, you must be informed. And when you're informed, you will know how to deal with each factor. If you're going into a farmer's protest, you know what the farmers are protesting about. You know what the politician's stand is. You know what the police's stand is. And accordingly, depending on what facts you see on the ground, you present your story in that ideal way. If you're going there without any information and ignorance of what the facts are, then you are going by just say for instance, you don't know anything about the protest and you're standing with the police, then you're only going to report on what you see there. So you have to arm yourself with knowledge before you reach the spot, until and unless it is something, like I said, which happens on the spur of the moment, and it's an event or a attack or a calamity that happens in front of you, then you report what you see. But other than that, in a situation where you're going, you must have prior knowledge of what you're getting into or what you're reporting. And most journalists have that in terms of sources, in terms of information that they're reading about policy matters that have happened and political developments. And then they go in and deal with each situation as a journalist would. So when I'm talking to protesters, farmer protesters, I will ask questions that are relevant to them. When I talk to politicians, I will ask questions that are relevant to them. When I talk to the police, I will ask questions that are relevant to them. And apart from that, as the situation develops around me, I will report it factually, given my prior knowledge of what is the basic fundamental issue at play.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And I guess that already given us a lot of insight how you actually report while on ground, because definitely preparation is really important, and at the same time how things change and how you actually mold yourself accordingly is actually coming together. And I just shift a little because we have a question from the audience and we're actually running out of time, so we have to shift there as well. So
Sure.
one question is related to something I believe you have already answered it, but I think it's an important question that I should highlight as well. So what is the impact on women when the news is constantly reported from a male point of view?
Say that again, please.
What is the impact on women when the news is constantly reported from a male point of view?
Okay, very interesting question. I think I think the one example that comes to mind, when you look at a particular story from a male point of view, um, say for instance a complete disregard to the sanctity of a victim of sexual assault or rape, uh, and if there is a certain kind of insensitivity that perhaps a man might not understand, that maybe a woman would understand better. um, that is one example that immediately comes to mind. of a certain kind of sensitivity that perhaps might be inherent in a woman. I'm not saying it's a given, because I've seen a lot of female journalists have the same amount of, insensitivity in dealing with it, that it's a story and we need to get the story out. So I would say that that perhaps is one issue where there would be an inherent difference between a male and female point of view, but not necessarily being the case all the time. I hope that answers the question of your view. Maybe I didn't understand it right.
Definitely, ma'am. I guess you have already answered it, and somewhere I think the question is itself too heavy. It's just a one-liner, but it actually entails a lot of information and I would say perspective within it. So, and we have another question that is, women journalists are often indirectly from, I'm sorry, often buried subtly and indirectly from pursuing and filling hardcore stories and set off for very easy or safe women-friendly issues. So, where do you see it coming specifically based on your experience?
No, who has asked this question? I'd like to address the person. Would you know the name of the person by any chance?
Also, do you have the name? Like it's just coming in, so we
Okay,
don't
no
have it
worries.
because
No
there are
worries.
different platforms that it comes to. So
No worries. So, to the person who's asking the question, I don't. I mean, look around you. I have so many names. I don't want to name any one particular journalist, but so many female journalists who are reporting from. Let's take this pandemic. They're reporting from inside hospitals to crematoriums to rallies, political rallies. These are hardcore political stories. I mean, we have journalists who have reported on conflict. I did 2611. I mean, let's give examples. Look at Barkha, who's traveling across the country and reporting from any possible place. You have Preeti, like I mentioned, who's reporting from inside various parts of Uttar Pradesh. These are very, very hardcore, hard news stories, as they're called. So I don't see, any difference there, honestly. I mean, there's Dhanya Rajendran in down south, who has been reporting on. I'm sorry, the light has gone again. So, so so yes, I don't think women are just given frivolous or soft stories per se. Gone are those days. There are innumerable print journalists. I mean, across the board, digital journalists who are going everywhere, men, women, both, with equal gusto, and putting their lives at risk and reporting. So it is not just the purview of men anymore. In fact, I personally feel that there are more women journalists out in the field, and especially in the TV space, than male journalists also at times.
definitely, Mama. I guess I completely agree with you because there are so many examples that we have. I would say we
Yes,
just don't need to
yes.
go anywhere else. And ma'am, there's one thing, and because we are running out of time, so I think I would like to end with this particular. It's not a question. It's actually just learning from experience. You mentioned one thing that now you have one more thing in various role that you have played, that is entrepreneurship.
Yes.
So would you like to just share a little bit more about the same?
So I run a company called Studio Talk along with a colleague of mine, and we have a team based out of headquartered out of Mumbai. We essentially deal with media relations, uh, media policy, production, research, and it's a 10-year-old company. And we have a team of about 20-25 people spread across India. But like I said, headquartered in Mumbai. It's a wonderful experience to be an entrepreneur, to be your own boss, as they say, but it's hard work. It's very, very hard work and requires a lot of discipline. And again, like I said, that perhaps in the newsroom, I came from a point of privilege, having had a good education and working with the country's best channels. But when you're an entrepreneur, you start from a rock bottom, right? And every day is a struggle. And despite that, I believe that despite being a woman, uh, at the end of the day, it is an amount of discipline, uh, perseverance, and constantly, there's no substitute to hard work. And I believe that if you persevere, of course, it's a hard road, but if you persevere and if you have that level of discipline, I think you can move forward.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I guess uh, there is a lot to learn from you, and specifically from this particular point of view, when you have actually turned into an entrepreneur and actually leading everything from your own perspective. But unfortunately, we are actually, we have just come to the very end.
Yeah.
So we don't have much time. So I just hope that we have this privilege of having another session with you in which we can actually talk about these things from this particular perspective of how women as a leader, as an entrepreneur, is actually dealing with this entire field of media and how it's actually impacting it.
Sure.
So with this, I guess I would like to thank you, ma'am, for taking this time and actually having this discussion, such an enriching discussion where you actually talked about a lot of various perspectives and various dimensions, I would say, coming starting from education, what are the challenges on field like infrastructure, physical, and other things, and then at the same time, what are the major challenges, as well as how I would say you have broke down various stereotypes. For example, one of the question that came out at the very end, like how women are given very soft stories, which is not the case right now. So thank you very much, ma'am, for this enriching discussion with us. And at the same time, I would like to thank each and every person who has joined us today, our audience. Uh, Thank you for all your support. We have not been um, wouldn't have been able to continue with this series without you all and your constant support. And at the end, our entire team for your constant backup and your various ideas. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And with this, I would like to ask Tosif to please end the live session.